Dr. Victoria Sloane stopped mid-sentence in front of 200 international medical executives and pointed at the man in the gray maintenance uniform who had just appeared near the side panel of the hotel's grand ballroom. Her voice carried across the entire room without effort, sharp and certain in the way that only comes from years of never once being told no. "Someone tell me," she said, "why there is a repairman standing inside a $300 million presentation." The man she was pointing at did not flinch. He set his toolbox down quietly beside the ventilation panel he had been working on, straightened up, and looked at her with an expression that gave nothing away. His name was Wade Callister. He was 49 years old, wore a worn gray work shirt with a company patch on the sleeve, and had calluses on both hands from 2 decades of working with tools. He was also, though no one in that room yet knew it, the sole inventor and patent holder of the very technology Dr. Sloane had spent the last 40 minutes describing as the future of cardiac diagnostics. Wade asked her, calmly and without raising his voice, whether she was still planning to present PulseSync as her company's own development during the afternoon session. Dr. Sloane laughed the way people laugh when they are absolutely certain they are the most important person in the room. She told the audience that apparently the hotel had hired repairmen who eavesdropped on executive briefings and then pretended to understand what they had heard. There was laughter. Not everyone laughed, but enough did. Wade picked up his toolbox, nodded once, and walked out of the room. His attorney was already waiting in the hallway, holding a folder and wearing an expression Wade recognized immediately. Because he had seen that same expression on a doctor's face in a hospital corridor 7 years earlier, right before everything in his life changed. The morning before his shift, Wade Callister had stood at the kitchen counter of his apartment in Columbus, Ohio, listening to his 14-year-old son, Finn, eat cereal too fast in the way teenagers do when they are running late for something they forgot to mention. Finn had his mother's eyes, which was something Wade noticed most on mornings when the light came through the kitchen window at a certain angle. He had also inherited her heart condition, the same rare arrhythmia that had gone undetected for years until it was far too late to do anything useful about it. Wade had left his position as a biomedical engineer 18 months after Adrian died, not because the grief made work impossible, but because Finn needed someone home and present in the way that a salaried research career did not allow. He had taken the maintenance job at Meridian Building Services because the schedule was flexible and the work asked nothing of him beyond showing up and solving the problem directly in front of him. He had spent 30 years being precise and methodical, and there was a kind of relief in the honesty of broken machinery. A thing was either fixed or it was not. There was no committee to report to, no quarterly presentation, no one asking him to reframe the problem so it sounded better to investors. He had started building PulseSync on his kitchen table 8 months after Adrian's funeral, not because he expected it to become anything, but because the device that could have found her arrhythmia before it became fatal did not yet exist in the form it needed to. He built it the way he had always built things, carefully, without announcing himself, without asking anyone's permission to care about something. The prototype sat on a shelf in the second bedroom for 2 years, before a former colleague saw a photograph of it on Wade's phone at a conference and refused to let the subject drop. By the time Sloane Biomedical reached out through an intermediary, PulseSync had already been validated in 2 independent clinical trials. The licensing offer had climbed to $320 million. Wade had never mentioned any of it to Meridian Building Services. He had insisted from the beginning of negotiations that his name stay out of every document until the final signing. Not because he was playing games, but because he wanted to know exactly what kind of company he was about to hand his invention to before they knew they needed his signature. He kissed the top of Finn's head on his way out, told him to put the bowl in the sink and not on the counter, and drove to the Grantham Hotel to fix a ventilation panel that had been flagging errors in the ballroom's environmental system for 3 days. The MedTech Summit drew the kind of crowd that made certain people forget how to be ordinary. Wade had worked events like this before. He knew the type, not the doctors, most of whom were genuinely absorbed in the science, but the executives in the front seats who treated hotel staff, maintenance workers, and anyone else in a uniform as part of the furniture. He was not offended by it. He had simply stopped being surprised by it a long time ago. He had arrived early to avoid disrupting the morning presentations and had nearly finished the repair when the breakout session in the main ballroom ran long. He was tightening the last access panel when Dr. Victoria Sloane stepped into the corridor to take a phone call, accompanied by 2 members of her communications team, who stood at a respectful distance while she spoke. Wade had read about Dr. Sloane during the negotiation process. She was 53, had built Sloane Biomedical from a mid-sized diagnostics firm into a company with a market cap north of $4 billion, and had a reputation for acquiring innovative technology quickly and decisively. She was also known, according to 2 separate sources his attorney Carl Iverson had spoken with, for ensuring that acquired intellectual property became associated exclusively with the Sloane Biomedical name once the ink was dry. She ended her call and noticed Wade immediately in the way people notice things they find irritating. He introduced himself by first name the way he always did on a job site, told her he was nearly finished and would be out of the corridor shortly. She looked at the toolbox, then at the company patch on his sleeve, then back at him with the particular expression of someone who has decided in advance that a conversation is beneath them. She asked whether he had been inside the ballroom during the morning presentation. He told her he had been working on the panel near the east access point. Yes. She turned to one of her communication staff and said, in a tone not quite directed at Wade, but clearly meant for him, that it was remarkable how some people spent entire careers maintaining systems they would never understand, and apparently saw no problem walking in and out of rooms full of people working at an entirely different level. Wade said nothing. She looked at him then, directly. She told him that companies like Sloane Biomedical built things that changed lives. Men like him, she said, kept the lights on so that people who built things could do their real work without distraction. She hoped he understood the distinction. Wade considered the ventilation panel for a moment. Then he asked whether she was aware that the implementation framework her team had submitted to the FDA still contained an unresolved conflict with the original patent's independent claims, specifically in the algorithm governing the arrhythmia detection threshold. He told her he mentioned it only because that conflict would surface immediately if any third party compared the submission against the registered patent documentation. Dr. Sloane's expression shifted. He asked again, the same way he had inside the ballroom, whether she was still planning to present PulseSync as Sloane Biomedical's proprietary development during the afternoon session. She did not laugh this time. Carl Iverson was already walking toward them from the far end of the corridor. Carl spent 30 seconds speaking quietly near Dr. Sloane's ear. Wade watched her expression move through several distinct stages, confusion, then the early mechanics of calculation, then a flatness that settled over her face like a shutter coming down. She turned and looked at Wade the way a person looks at something they cannot fit into any category they already understand. Carl told her, without editorial, that Wade Callister was the registered inventor and sole patent holder of PulseSync, that Callister Biomedical LLC held the exclusive rights to the technology, and that the licensing negotiations Sloane Biomedical had been conducting for the past 8 months had been carried out with Wade's full knowledge, and under his specific instruction that his identity remain undisclosed until a final agreement was signed. Dr. Sloane said that was not possible. Wade told her that he had worked maintenance jobs for most of the past 7 years and had never once claimed otherwise. He said that nothing about that evening was a test or a setup, and that he had genuinely been fixing a ventilation panel. He said that what had happened inside the ballroom and what had happened in the corridor was not something he could set aside simply because a number had been attached to a signature page. She recovered faster than some people would have. She told him she was prepared to increase the total licensing offer by an additional $30 million, effective immediately, and that she was also prepared to formally acknowledge his contribution in all future marketing materials, something that had not been on the table previously. Wade told her he appreciated the offer. Then he asked Carl to formally notify Sloane Biomedical that Callister Biomedical LLC was withdrawing from all current licensing negotiations, effective that evening, and to prepare the documentation accordingly. The campaign against Wade Callister began within 48 hours. Sloane Biomedical's communications team released a statement describing a preliminary negotiation that had collapsed due to the inventor's unprofessional conduct and unrealistic demands. The statement mentioned with apparent casualness that the inventor had been employed as a hotel maintenance worker at the time the talks broke down, a detail that spread through several medical trade publications before the week was out. 2 of those publications ran the story under headlines that managed to imply, without stating it directly, that a person of Wade's background could not realistically be expected to manage the business side of a major licensing agreement. One used the word handyman in the opening paragraph. Sloane Biomedical's legal team filed a preliminary claim alleging bad faith negotiation, citing Wade's failure to disclose his identity as evidence of deliberate deception designed to extract a higher offer. Ray Donahue, the owner of Meridian Building Services, and the closest thing Wade had to a friend outside of family, received a call from the Grantham Hotel's facilities director 3 days after the summit ended. The hotel was reconsidering its maintenance contract. 2 other corporate clients in the same week quietly informed Meridian that they were reviewing their service arrangements. Ray did not ask Wade to explain himself. He only mentioned it once, during a slow Tuesday morning, and the way he mentioned it was careful and without accusation. But Wade heard what was underneath it because he had known Ray for 6 years and understood exactly what it cost him to bring it up at all. Finn noticed that his father had stopped sleeping at a normal hour. He noticed the stack of legal documents on the kitchen table that grew incrementally each morning. He did not ask Wade to back down. He only said, one evening while they were watching something neither of them was actually paying attention to, that whatever his father was protecting, he hoped it was the right thing. He said it the way 14-year-olds say things that matter, sideways, without full eye contact, in a voice that wants to sound casual and does not quite manage it. Wade told him he hoped so too. Dr. Sloane's COO, a man named Bryce Hollister, reached out to 3 of the independent researchers who had participated in PulseSync's clinical validation, suggesting that their continued involvement in any Sloane-adjacent research funding was contingent on their willingness to make public statements questioning the device's efficacy. 2 declined immediately. The third called Carl Iverson and reported the conversation verbatim. The same week, Wade learned through Carl that Sloane Biomedical had quietly retained a consulting group to analyze the publicly available documentation on PulseSync's detection algorithm. They were not attempting to reverse engineer the device. The patent protections made that too direct a risk. Instead, they appeared to be constructing a parallel diagnostic system that stayed just outside the patent's core claims while replicating its functional outcome. Carl estimated they were at least 18 months away from anything viable, but 18 months was enough time to create market uncertainty, depress any competing offer Wade might receive, and exhaust Callister Biomedical's operating capital in the interim. Wade sat with that assessment long after Carl had finished explaining it. He was in the second bedroom, the one where PulseSync's original prototype still occupied the shelf beside Adrian's cardiology's textbooks, the ones she had used in residency, and that he had never been able to donate because they still had her handwriting in the margins. He was not a sentimental man by habit, but grief has a way of making certain objects feel load-bearing in ways that are difficult to explain to anyone who has not experienced the specific weight of them. He pulled out the FDA submission documentation Carl had obtained through discovery and read it again, more slowly than the first time. 2 hours in, he found the section that had been quietly rewritten. The original licensing agreement had included a clause, one Wade had personally requested, and Carl had spent 3 weeks making airtight, requiring that PulseSync be offered to federally qualified health centers at a cost-controlled price point for the first 5 years of deployment. The clause also prohibited using the device's data outputs in any insurance underwriting decisions without the explicit written consent of the patient. Both provisions had been removed from the version submitted to Sloane Biomedical's board for approval. Wade's name appeared nowhere in that board-facing document. The algorithm's performance metrics had been inflated by 11% in one of the validation summaries, and the modification had been made after the independent researchers had already signed off on the original figures. Carl contacted Dana Whitcomb, Sloane Biomedical's general counsel, on a Thursday afternoon. He did not accuse. He simply asked, in the precise and unhurried way that experienced attorneys ask things they already know the answer to, whether the board was aware of the discrepancy between the filed patent claims and the FDA submission language. He asked whether the board had seen the original cost access clause before it was removed. Dana Whitcomb called back that same evening. Her voice was quiet, and she chose her words carefully, the way someone chooses words when they are trying to be useful without yet fully committing to a side. She told Carl she had flagged the clause removal internally 3 months ago and had been told by Dr. Sloane directly that the provision was not standard industry practice and had been removed as a routine negotiating adjustment. She had been given the modified validation summary without being informed it had been changed from the original. She had a copy of the original, time-stamped, on a personal server she maintained for exactly this kind of situation. She was not ready to testify to any of it yet, but she made certain Carl understood precisely where to look. Wade did not sleep much the week before the Sloane Biomedical board meeting. He spent most of those nights at the kitchen table, in the same particular quiet he had lived in during the months, right after Adrian died. Not because the grief was the same, but because the stillness was, and because his mind had always worked best in the hours when no one needed anything from him. Finn found him there twice, both times before dawn, and both times did the same thing, made coffee, sat down across the table without asking for an explanation, and kept him company until it was time to get ready for school. Wade watched his son pour carefully, focused on doing the small thing exactly right, and thought about how the most important things Finn had inherited from Adrian were not the medical ones. Dana Whitcomb formally provided Carl with the original time-stamped documentation 4 days before the board meeting. The modified validation summary, the board-facing agreement with the access clauses stripped out, 3 internal email threads in which Bryce Callister discussed in plain language the financial advantage of deploying PulseSync through premium health systems exclusively before any cost access requirements could be enforced. In one of those threads, Dr. Sloane had replied to Bryce's summary with 2 words, "Move forward." The Sloane Biomedical boardroom was on the 41st floor of a Chicago building that was all glass and reflected sky, the kind of structure that communicated permanence and importance without saying so directly. Wade rode the elevator with Carl and thought briefly about the number of times he had taken a service elevator in buildings like this one, carrying equipment up the back route, because the lobby was reserved for guests. He was wearing a plain dark suit he had owned for 8 years and had last worn to Adrian's memorial service. It still fit. Dr. Sloane arrived with Bryce Hollister beside her, and the composure of someone who had not yet accepted that the ground had shifted. When she saw Wade seated at the conference table, she informed the room, with controlled amusement, that it was interesting to see a maintenance worker at a boardroom table, and that she hoped everyone had already checked their HVAC units before the meeting began. Wade told her he understood exactly what kind of meeting this was. He told her that this time she was the one waiting on a decision that was not hers to make. Carl presented the evidence in sequence: the original cost access clause and its removal, the modified validation summary and the timestamp showing when the alteration had been made, the email chain, the move forward reply, the parallel consulting arrangement, and its connection to the documented pressure campaign against the independent researchers. The origin of the coordinated effort against Meridian Building Services, traced through billing records to a firm under direct contract with Sloane Biomedical's communications budget. Dr. Sloane told the board the documentation had been taken out of context. She said that Bryce had acted without her full authorization on several of the subsidiary matters. Bryce, without hesitation, told the board that every action he had taken had been carried out under Dr. Sloane's direct instruction, and that he had the message threads to support that statement. Dana Whitcomb confirmed on the record that the original documentation was authentic and that the alterations had been made after the date Dr. Sloane had represented to the board as the finalization date. The room held a long silence. Then Wade told the board that the question of licensing PulseSync to Sloane Biomedical was no longer under consideration because he had signed a different agreement 4 days earlier. Callister Biomedical LLC had entered into a licensing partnership with the Meridian Health Collective, a coalition of 47 independent hospital systems and federally qualified health centers operating across 19 states. The agreement was worth $340 million over 10 years. It preserved every condition Wade had insisted on from the beginning. The cost access provisions, the prohibition on using the device's outputs in insurance underwriting, a retraining fund for any clinical staff whose roles were affected during the transition. It included equity stakes for the 2 independent researchers who had contributed substantially to the validation work. And it contained a provision Wade had insisted on personally, that the device carry the name of its inventor on every unit distributed. He had not chosen the Meridian Health Collective because the number was higher, though it was. He had chosen them because Finn had spent 17 days in a Meridian-affiliated hospital after his first significant arrhythmia episode, and because every nurse, every technician, every person in a uniform who had come through that room had treated his son as though his life mattered regardless of what his father did for a living. The Sloane Biomedical Board voted to suspend Dr. Sloane pending a full internal investigation. Bryce Hollister was terminated the same afternoon. The FDA opened a formal review. Shareholders filed 3 separate civil actions within the following month. Dr. Sloane walked out of the 41st floor, still attempting to give instructions to her assistant, though her assistant had already been reassigned by the building's security desk and was no longer receiving her calls. Ray Donahue's contracts with the hotels and corporate facilities that had quietly dropped. Meridian Building Services were restored within 6 weeks, once it became publicly clear that the pressure campaign had originated with Sloane Biomedical's communications budget. Wade used a portion of the first licensing payment to compensate Meridian for the documented losses during the campaign. He offered Ray a formal apology in person, sitting in Ray's office with bad coffee, and the window unit rattling the way it always did. Ray told him he didn't need an apology. He said he had always figured there was more to the situation than a maintenance guy getting into an argument with a pharmaceutical CEO, and that he would have liked to have known about it sooner, and also that he was not remotely surprised. Finn said almost nothing when Wade told him about the Meridian Agreement. He sat across the kitchen table and listened, then asked two specific and technical questions about how the cost access provision would be enforced in practice, which told Wade that he had been paying closer attention to the whole situation than he had ever let on. Then Finn asked whether his father was going to quit Meridian Building Services. Wade said he was going to step back from field work gradually, because there were things at Callister Biomedical that now needed his full attention. But he told Finn that he did not intend to pretend that the past 7 years had not happened, or to treat the work he had done during those years as something to move past as quickly as possible. He told his son that dignity was not assigned by a job title or an income level, or the kind of door you entered when you arrived at a building. The only thing that ever actually defined a person, he said, was how they treated the people directly in front of them, especially the people who could not give them anything in return. Finn listened to all of it. Then he said, in the exact tone his mother had used when she was about to puncture something gently, that it was a good speech, and also that there was a water stain on the kitchen ceiling that had been there for 3 months, and someone probably ought to look at it. Wade looked at the ceiling. He told Finn he would get to it this weekend. 3 months after the Meridian Agreement was signed, PulseSync began deployment across the first 12 health centers in the collective. In the first week of operation, the device flagged 4 arrhythmias that would not have been detected by existing standard of care protocols. 2 of those patients were children. Wade received the notification on a Tuesday morning, while standing in the second bedroom beside the shelf, where the original prototype still sat next to Adrian's cardiology textbooks with her handwriting in the margins. He read the clinical summary twice, then put his phone back in his pocket and stood there in the quiet of the apartment for a moment, listening to the ordinary sounds of the building around him. A door closing somewhere down the hallway, a truck passing on the street below, Finn running water in the bathroom before school. He had never expected the device to change his life. He had built it because Adrian deserved a world where it existed, and because Finn deserved the chance she had never gotten. That it had also dismantled a $300 million acquisition and a corporation's entire international strategy was, in the end, beside the point. Dr. Victoria Sloane had once pointed across a crowded room and told him, in front of 200 people, that men like him kept the lights on, so that people like her could do work that actually mattered. She had never considered, not for a single moment, that the man keeping her lights on might be the only person alive who could also turn them off. That assumption had been the one thing standing between her and everything she wanted, and she had carried it into the room herself.